The proof is in the pudding, guys. These people lean on their strength base as a support system for their hypertrophic goals. If the strength base did not exist, they would be capped in their ability to build muscle. What's up, guys? Alec, Enkiri here, and I saw an interesting video from Dr. Mike Israetel of Renaissance Periodization pop up on my YouTube feed this past week. It was called Natties Need to Get Stronger, Enhanced Don't. And that video is part of his Fitness Myths series, and so it intrigued me and I clicked on it.
People say, look, if you're natty, if you're natural, you're not using drugs, you need to train mostly in the 5 to 10 rep range, maybe in the 8 to 12 range a little bit. You need to progress in load, mostly on the compound heavy barbell basics. None of this pump work or less pump work, fewer isolations, less high rep stuff. That's how natties grow best, lots of people say on the internet. Now, if you're enhanced, these people will also say you should train mostly in the 12 to 30 rep range, or at least it works for you. Progressive overload doesn't have to happen anymore because drugs.
And it was a good video. I encourage you guys to go watch it. Watch it so you can get the full context of everything that I'm going to say here today. It is linked below in the description for those who are interested. But there were some parts in that video that I really wanted to speak on. I don't want to go over the entire video here. Like I said, if you want the whole context, go watch it. So I'm not going to cover the entire thing, but there were a few pieces here and there, some major parts that I wanted to interject onto, add some of my own thoughts onto for those who see the value there, for those who care about what little old me thinks, and maybe throw an opposing opinion onto some of the pieces in that video from Dr. Mike. I certainly didn't disagree with everything that he said in his video. I certainly didn't agree with everything either, but so basically I just kind of want to run through some of those major points. Run through the major points, add my 2 cents, give you guys some thoughts. Let's just jump right into it.
The research on metabolites and high reps and pump stuff working just as well for hypertrophy in any unit of time it has been measured so far as strength work or strong, lower rep work, so that's a 5 to 10 versus pump and metabolite stuff. The research showing that that stuff is roughly equivalent is done exclusively on natties, almost exclusively. There's 3 studies ever on enhanced people with training, right? So we know that shit works for them, full stop. So if you're saying, man, pump metabolite stuff doesn't work for natties, you are not just making something up, you're making something up that is both wrong and directly contradicts the very primary literature you love to cite to support your points. So full stop, that's just BS.
So I'm going to interject here real quick with an example to counter Dr. Mike's point. Now, I don't know the studies to which he's referring to here. I would honestly like to take a look at them if I could. If he'll link me to them, that'd be awesome so that I can check them out for myself. I'm sure, and I'm not doubting them at all, okay? I'm sure that they're completely valid studies. I'm not discounting that, not even a single bit. What I am going to do here, though, is conjecture that the scope of their validity is going to be limited, or myopic, we'll say, because they're training studies. They're training studies. All training studies pretty much are myopic. They are short-term by nature. So I just want to use the example here of a tennis player, right? I personally played tennis for like 15 years or so. So it's also a personal experience of mine. I've seen it many times. I've experienced it myself. And so what happens? You play tennis, right? You play all the time. You play hours a day when you're really trying to get good. You swing that racket over and over and over and over again. And dude, your freaking forearms, man, they get, let's see, can we get a good angle here? Where's my forearm? There we go. That's not bad. That's not bad, right? Yeah, see, your forearms, man, they get freaking yoked, dude. And you don't work your upper arms at that time. You're just a tennis player. You got these big old forearms, you got no upper arms, and you look like fucking Popeye. They really do grow quite impressively solely by virtue of the volume of the stimulus there, because there's almost no intensity there whatsoever, right? You're just swinging a tennis racket, which only weighs a few ounces, against air and making contact against a light tennis ball. So there's no intensity. It is solely growth by volume of work. Now, what happens is they grow and they grow, right? And then all of a sudden, as if by magic, as if somebody just turned off the light switch, they never ever grow again. And so you're swinging that racket 3 or 4 or even 5 hours per day, and you never see any more forearm growth because the intensity is static. And now the volume is capped, right? You can only play tennis so much. So the intensity has always been static, and now the volume is capped. And if you wanted them to grow again, if you wanted them to grow bigger, you would have to use a heavier racket, which isn't really something that happens. And so that's kind of the limitation there, right? So that something that I want to kind of go out on a big wild limb and hypothesize here is that the studies that he's referring to right here didn't look past this point of stagnation that I'm referring to, because they couldn't look past this point because you aren't even going to get to this point in a training study. You're talking about 12 weeks or 24 weeks or maybe 52 weeks at the very absolute most. But this point of stagnation would be a slightly longer term process than that. But eventually, wherever that point happens to be, a hard ceiling is going to be created. And at that point, if all you do is the same sort of stuff that you've been doing, that in what he's referring to, the pump and the metabolite work, if that's all you're doing, you'll never grow any more muscle beyond this point. Once you get to that ceiling, you're never going to break through that ceiling. Otherwise, every single professional tennis player in the world would have forearms that were bigger than their freaking thighs, and they'd have to start running around on their knuckles like they were a gorilla. If we want to go even further into that point, somebody like Lance Armstrong, cycling, hours. That is pump, that is metabolite work. He'd have the biggest freaking quads in the world, right? That's even more resistance on a bicycle in cycling than you get from playing tennis. So his quads should be huge, but they're not. That young woman who swam across the English Channel all those years ago, she should have shoulders that are so freaking big that she can't even stand upright. But that stuff doesn't happen because that's just not the way that life works.
Second, people say, well, yeah, that works for enhanced people. How do they know that? Well, there's almost zero research on what works best for enhanced. So you don't actually know what the research says. You just know what pros do. Except here's the problem. Most natural pros
Don't do it, Mike!
train just about the same way as enhanced pros. Bro splits, drop sets, pumps, shit like that. How come you don't hear much about that?
He did it. I'll just go ahead and state the obvious here, guys. It's because they're not natural.
They say, well, natties train non-bro style, enhanced people train like bros. The thing is, these are exceptions, not rules. Most are bros in the natty community, just like enhanced. No offense or anything like that. If you've ever seen like Doug Miller, one of the best natural pros ever, train, he trains like a bro. It's not that there's something super wrong with that. It's just like that's the reality. And tons of natural pros, the guys actually winning most of the pro shows, they train like bros. They train the same way as enhanced people.
Now, I haven't seen this guy, Doug Miller, before. I don't pay too much attention to bodybuilding, natural or otherwise. But after Mike used him as an example here, I did go ahead and I looked him up, and I'm going to let you guys formulate your own opinions here as to his potential natural status, but I did just want to throw in the opinion of Derek from More Plates, More Dates, since he's pretty well versed on these sorts of things.
This guy is basically exceeding proportional Keon Pearson numbers as a white guy. Frankly, white guys are less likely to be genetic phenoms in bodybuilding, it seems like. Physique in general, like, obviously doesn't look natural. There's a reason this guy is called Drug Miller. And like, no one really believes him, but his arms look absolutely like out of proportion as hell. You know, the contest shots where he's at his peak, just absolutely absurd, dude, to the point where it's like inconceivable to think that he's not doing something. The testing parameters of the league he is in are subpar for sure. So that is my conclusion. I don't think you can say this guy is definitely natural. He would need to do more to prove otherwise. And I think people are going to continue to, speculate that he's unnatural, and I can see why.
So it just kind of feels like a poor example to me here, man. According to Derek, everybody already basically thinks that this guy is on drugs. Derek himself says it would be incredibly unlikely for him to be able to do what he has done naturally. And now Mike is saying essentially that the guy trains in a suboptimal fashion as well. I haven't really seen his training. I saw a little bit of it on his Instagram, but there's not that much actually. Mike must follow it somewhere though, and even he is saying that the guy trains like a bro, which we've basically acknowledged at this point, and that Mike kind of gets to again at the end of his video, that that's kind of suboptimal as a way to train in general. And yet, in spite of all that, this guy has still managed to build so much muscle, be so freaking jacked and peeled, that his nickname is actually Drug Miller. And so this example, it really just doesn't support Mike's kind of pseudo assertion here that he's created up to this point in the video, that naturals are going to be able to build appreciable amounts of muscle just with fluff and pump work, or as he's calling it, metabolite work. And even then, even if we factor all that into the equation, we also have to acknowledge the fact that Doug himself is apparently capable of pulling 6 plates for 5 reps like it's a goddamn joke just 2 days after winning a bodybuilding show. So that's while being cut way down in body weight, potentially still depleted, potentially a bit overtrained as well. And maybe it's just me, but I feel like using a guy who can do something like that as an example of why strength doesn't really matter in terms of muscular hypertrophy was actually a pretty poor choice on Mike's part. Does it really matter how Doug trains most of the time now at age 35 or whatever he is at this point, if he is capable of pulling off a feat like that on a whim just 2 days after winning a bodybuilding show?
So that's the reality. So this whole thing of like, well, Natties train like this, and enhanced pros train like that, that's mostly artifact. That's not even actually real. And beginners might benefit a bit more from compounds and lower reps, but that's not natty. That's just beginner. It's not natty versus enhanced. It's another illusion. And it's easy to confound the two because there's thankfully a huge overlap between natty and beginner.
But this isn't a matter of confounding variables or confusing natty with beginner. It's a matter of acknowledging the fact that strength supports the long-term endeavor of hypertrophy, just like hypertrophy supports the long-term endeavor of strength. They're two different pieces, but each one nudges the other one up continuously. And that is why the concepts are inseparable. There is a reason why Dr. Mike himself was benching 375 pounds or whatever it was at age 19 or whatever crazy young age that it was, and why he was able to get to where he is because of that. There is a reason why natural hypertrophy is deadlifting 495 for 2 reps, squatting 385 for 7, and that's just the most recent stuff I was able to find, and has gotten to where he is. There is a reason why Doug Miller can rep 6 plates on the deadlift like it's freaking candy and has gotten to where he is, the best natural bodybuilder that's ever lived, right? The proof is in the pudding, guys. These people lean on their strength base as a support system for their hypertrophic goals. If the strength base did not exist, they would be capped in their ability to build muscle after they'd reached a certain point, a point that was far, far away from their genetic ceiling. Point frickin' blank. Just like how the tennis players' forearms don't grow bigger and bigger forever. And you can't tell me that a natural lifter who lacks these aforementioned capacities can achieve something even within the same planet as these other guys in terms of muscular hypertrophy if that same guy was to spend all his time doing pump work and metabolite work, because that particular flavor of pudding doesn't fucking exist.
All right. That being said, what are the grains of truth? Beginners might benefit from more compounds and lower reps. A lot of it is to establish technique. Another thing is compounds often offer higher raw stimulus magnitudes. The total amount of muscular growth you can get from them is higher at the expense of usually higher fatigue. However, when you're a beginner, you're so small and weak relative to where you're going to be eventually that your total fatigue almost never limits you. So you can cash in and get the huge raw stimulus magnitude of compounds more, whereas when you're more advanced, you just can't afford that level of fatigue and you'll have to do more isolation. So there's something to that.
So here Dr. Mike's kind of acknowledging the importance of essentially what he would consider, at least from what I've gathered up to this point in the video, what he would consider not training like a bro, especially earlier on in the game. He's saying it's important to not train that way earlier on in the game, or at least that there's more value to not train that way earlier on in the game. And see, my fear is slightly tangential, but also relevant. My fear is that people hear what he was saying earlier on in his video, and then they just kind of run with it, right? And it's odd to me because the sentiment, sorry guys, it's odd to me because the sentiment of not needing to build a base, it seems to be something that's been leaching out into the zeitgeist more and more frequently in recent history. And yet, it's always coming from people who have a massive base to lean on. And so my fear is that novices hear that type of stuff, and then they basically end up spinning their wheels forever because they never actually get around to building that base for themselves. Most likely because they don't understand how to, and with all this stuff coming out, they just never learn how to do it properly. Because there are so many people out there echoing sentiments that kind of diminish the importance of that concept in general, which is unfortunate. And that is why, personally, I take pretty much every opportunity that I can to highlight how important that base building phase is, that base building process is for your long-term success in this game. Sorry about that plane, but I'm not redoing this take.
Secondly, very related, advanced folks might do more pump and metabolite work because bigger muscles sequester metabolites better and they benefit from it probably marginally a little bit better than beginners.
So basically, where hypertrophy is concerned, fluffy work has more value in general for people who are stronger. I think that we can all agree on that.
So you don't have to worry about natty or enhanced. You just train the right way like everyone is supposed to, with some nuances and differences between the two. Very, very nuances, not completely different training styles. And that training is generally a combination of rep ranges, a combination of isolation and compound movements, not just like you just do this, you just do that.
And I think we can all agree on this as well.
There doesn't have to be this thing where like, oh yeah, that's how enhanced train, or I'm natty, I train like this. You just train how you're supposed to train, good, high quality, all the rep ranges that work for you. Compounds and isolations, always a mix, always progressively overloading intelligently by adding a little bit of weight and a few reps here and there when you can, deloading when you need to, and that's it. And generally, everyone trains in a very similar fundamental way with some nuanced differences. There doesn't have to be this chasm between natty and enhanced, and that's really the deal.
So just one last thing I want to say here, one final point I want to make before I close, because Dr. Mike is right. There doesn't have to be this big chasm between natty and enhanced. There doesn't have to be. But there just is. And here's the problem with it. So all squares are rectangles, right? But not all rectangles are squares. And because we're all humans, we all respond to roughly the same sorts of training methodologies, the same sorts of stimuli. Now, you're going to have to vary those exact methodologies, the exact stimuli that you apply based on your particular goals. That's obvious. But if you share the same goals as somebody else, then you will both respond to roughly the same type of training, the same type of stimuli with similar adaptations because we are all rectangles, right? The problem, however, and I mean absolutely no offense here, I'm just running with my current analogy. The problem, however, is that a subset of us are also squares. These are the enhanced guys, right? So they're still rectangles because all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. And so these squares, these enhanced guys, they can train like a rectangle if they choose to because they are a rectangle. They are a human. So they can train like that and everything will be fucking hunky-dory. However, with that enhancement, they are also squares. And so you aren't a square unless you are also enhanced. And so as squares, those guys can bend the rules and train in a way that rectangles cannot train and actually do well on. So all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares, and all lifters can train the same way, but that subset of enhanced lifters can also, those squares can also get away with training differently if they want to. And that is why that chasm exists. But the problem is not that the chasm exists. Who the fuck really cares? I don't give a shit, and why should you? The problem, though, is when a square, when an enhanced guy tries to extrapolate those enhanced methodologies, those square methodologies, onto a rectangle, onto an unenhanced guy, either because they don't know any better or because they have some ulterior move. The problem is that is a one-way street. And so a perfect example of this is somebody like Ryan Humiston, right? Who basically got famous by doing this. But a lot of that information that got his name out there is actually a large disservice to many of the unenhanced people who are hearing it. And the natty guys in the YouTube community have kind of banded together over time and called him out on that type of bullshit. Not that it does anything, but still, you provide that opposing viewpoint. And so I really just want to note that before I close here. There is a distinction between natty training and enhanced training. In my opinion, it exists and it continues to exist primarily because the enhanced community, the squares, have found these little tips and tricks that work for them. And then they've proliferated that information and extrapolated it onto people who it doesn't apply to, because it gets them exposure on social media, and with that, it ultimately makes them money. But the converse statement here cannot be true, because anybody who's not enhanced but trains like an enhanced guy, i.e. suboptimally, as we've already established, will simply, because they're training suboptimally, will simply never be impressive enough to garner a substantial following on social media. So anyone who falls into that camp cannot possibly be responsible for being a proliferator of that type of misinformation. So blame the enhanced guys for the chasm. At least that's how I see it. Anyway, that's all I got for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative. Remember to smash the like button, leave me some love in the comments, sign up for my Patreon if you haven't already. I got a couple cool articles up there by now at this point. I got a free conjugate program up there as well, a couple Q&As, and the Discord server is starting to kick a little bit as well. We're going to start exchanging some pretty cool information on there coming up soon. Check out EnkiriEliteFitness.com for online coaching and training programs, and keep training hard. I'll catch you guys next time.